Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. Today's topic is the second half of our lecture on Gilded Age politics, specifically imperialism. Now, before we begin, as always, take a moment, hit pause on your video, jot down the lecture outline, and pay particular attention to those key terms at the left. Now, with that, let's get started. So we left off talking about these small pushes for reform during the Gilded Age. And while the capital P populist movement will not have a dramatic effect then, their ideas will come back around in the 20th century. And while the government itself is not very active domestically, the government will have a very active foreign policy agenda. You see, Manifest Destiny did not stop at the Pacific coast. In fact, the ideas of Manifest Destiny began to fuel a rising tide known as American imperialism. And America began to see itself as an expanding world power. So what is imperialism? Well, simply put, it is the country's policy of expanding its power or influence through diplomacy, indirectly, or military force directly. Let me add to that also economically. So it can also be culturally. So you can do diplomatic, you can do economic, you can do cultural, or you can do direct military force. But the point of imperialism is to expand and control. And so this became, during the post-bellum period, post-Civil War period, there began this idea of what was called a drive for empire. America needs to be an empire so they can compete with the big boys of Europe. And of course, this was built around money. Remember, it's always the economy. Instead, it's the economy, stupid. In this case, the drive for empire was centered around the capitalist desire to expand our economic impact. That's a very fancy way of saying more markets, more money. So if we can expand through imperialism into these new and control other countries, this is more people to buy our stuff, which means more money to line the pockets of the industrial capitalists, those robber barons. Now, there's multiple reasons for this. Now, it's never put in those terms because we don't want to think of it, it's just about the money. It is, that's the backbone foundation of it. But there are more, articulate ways of saying this. For example, remember that 1893 frontier thesis of Frederick Jackson Turner we talked about with the West Lecture? Well, remember, the frontier is an essential component of Americana. He also argues it's an essential component of the growth of the economy. And it's an essential component of the cultivation of democracy. In other words, we need to expand our culture to other areas because it's just part of being a democracy, right? To spread liberty throughout the world. And so America had already expanded from East Coast to West Coast. So therefore, we need to continue economic growth by expanding into new markets and new places. And on this idea of Manifest Destiny, frontier thesis, we begin to see various groups emerge that became known as imperialists. Now, collectively, they're called imperialists. Each one has their own reasons. These became known as different American factions. So who supported imperialism? Well, as other industrial nations competed for colonial possessions, remember, at this point, Africa has already been divided up. Many in America felt the United States needed to enter this global competition. And one of the big pushes and big impetuses for this growth was business leaders and large commercial farmers. Why? What is it they want? Well, number one, they want new markets. And for them, the market there, they'll take any market, right? Any market is a good market. But particularly, they want China. China had a massive population, one of the largest in the world, over 400 million in the late 19th century. And American tobacco producers were selling 1 billion cigarettes per year to those East Asian markets. So the question is, how do we get more of our product into East Asia, specifically China? Now, besides markets, though, there's some other reasons why business leaders and commercial farmers would push for this. Now, remember, we're a major industrial power, yes. One of the big things is these new markets would help with the problem of overproduction. Because remember, only so many Americans can buy so many things. There's only so many Americans to buy your stuff. And so one of the big problems of industrialization was, and also in big farming, was that when farmers grow too much product, they overproduce. They actually lose money because they can't sell their crops, which forces many farmers not to be able to repay their debt, which forces them into poverty. And of course, remember that Panic of 1893 we have? Yeah, that one. This will fuel this push even more. The thought was we could end recessions and depressions. Remember, we had a recession, depression, Panic of 1873, and one in 1893. Oh, fun fact, by the way, J.P. Morgan bailed out the U.S. government in 1893. Yeah, that's how rich he was. So the thought was we could end recessions and depressions and these panics of the economy by expanding into new markets, because therefore you would never have to overproduce because you can always sell your stuff to other nations. Also, labor strike. Remember that whole labor lecture, the rise of labor? Well, incidents like the Homestead strike, the Haymarket incident, the Pullman strike, these events underscored just how much discontent there was among labor workers. And of course, many of these strikes, they felt, were caused by the cyclical nature of the economy, the rising and falling of the economy, the ebb and flow, the boom and bust cycles. And because falling wages during depression pushed people into a corner, they fought back and they go on strikes, right? Labor strike. So theoretically, in their minds then, if America was able to solidify outside markets like Asia, the American labor force would consistently have jobs. Remember, no more bust cycle. And therefore, they would not have to decrease wages, which means no more labor strife. It will solve all of our labor problems. Now, is this realistic? No, because, well, eventually those markets also tap out. And also because, well, it doesn't deal with the long hours, the poor work conditions. But labor issues became an important pushing point for why business people, large commercial farmers and business leaders, wanted imperialism. A second major group were Protestant missionaries. Because they were, and again, they're also looking right at China, 400 million people. And they had the goal of civilizing, figures, preaching Jesus, to the so-called Asian backward masses. And of course, preaching the gospel of Jesus was their Christian duty. However, it got a new push in the late 1800s. And it got a new push thanks to a very popular poem, published by Rudyard Kipling. Now, Rudyard Kipling, he was an author who wrote a poem known as The White Man's Burden. And Christians took this up, and they kind of infused this white man's burden idea in with Christianity ideas of spreading the gospel of Jesus. And so the idea was you would, yes, save their souls, but you would also civilize them in the process and raise them up. And so what the white man's burden said was that it was the sad, humble, noble, but heavy duty of the white man to spread across the world and uplift those poor, uncivilized, savage people who are of darker or different skin colors. And it was the job of these pure white Westerners, that it was their humble burden and duty, given to them by God, their creator, to spread across the world and civilize and teach Jesus, but also teach them how to wash their hands and how to pray properly, and how to sit down for 3 meals a day, and how to eat wheat rather than corn, and how to eat properly with utensils. And rather than using the bread to pick things up, that's just weird. And how to not have these strange, weird gods that aren't really gods like Buddha. Instead, worship the true God in his son, Jesus Christ. And it became this infused message of the white man's burden alongside Christianity that would fuel missionaries to want to go into these new areas and to preach Jesus to the Chinese and other Southeast Asians. Oh, by the way, fun fact, if you recognize the name Rudyard Kipling, you probably don't know him from White Man's Burden. You might know him, however, from his more popular book, The Jungle Book. Yes, the one that Disney made a whole movie out of and was just remade recently into a live-action remake that only involved one human. Baloo and Kang, or Ka, and, Shere Khan. Yeah, that one. Mowgli. That was originally a book written by Rudyard Kipling. So missionaries wanted to push for imperialism. So did politicians and military strategists. Why? Well, simply put, expansion equals world power, right? You want to become a world power, you need to expand. But this idea was championed by one particular naval captain, Alfred Thayer Mahan. In 1890, he published a book that was known as The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. And in this book, he argues that national greatness and prosperity flows directly from being a major naval power. Look back in all of history, at least in the 1600s, every great nation had a great navy that they could use to conquer and travel and export throughout the world. And therefore, he championed, it was America's destiny to control the Caribbean via a strong navy and to spread Western civilization throughout the Pacific via a strong navy. And sure enough, Congress agrees with him. And they will launch a program to rebuild their navy. Because I got news for you. After the Civil War, our navy had kind of fallen on hard times, shall we say. In fact, following the Civil War, the U.S. Navy was rotting. It was ranked 12th in the world, behind such superpowers as Denmark and Chile. Yes, our Navy was weaker than Denmark and Chile. But thanks to government expenditures, Republicans supported this. Remember, 1890, we have Republicans control the presidency. And by the end of the decade, 1900, our U.S. Navy was now ranked 3rd in the world. Yeah, it's impressive in a 10-year span. And we will set out the Great White Fleet, and we will travel into the Caribbean, and more specifically into Japan, to try to open their ports to trade. And again, all these groups have one thing in common. They want and desire America to take its place alongside the other great colonial powers like Britain. They desire to control ports and territories beyond their own continental borders. And it classifies all of these groups as imperialists. Now, this process, however, remember the goal here is to get to China, right? This process starts very, very slowly. And it's the goal, again, is to get to China, right? That's the goal. It starts very slow, and it starts with this man right here, William Seward. Now, William Seward was Andrew Johnson's Secretary of State, and he saw the potential in Southeast Asia as a marketplace. However, it's not a quick, easy process. Instead, as Secretary of State, he begins to lay the important groundwork for later imperialism. He does so because, as Secretary of State in 1866, he learns that Russia is looking to unload some of its assets to get some money. And in 1867, Seward will negotiate with Russia, and for $7.2 million will purchase a frozen tundra known as Alaska. Now, if you think this is a great thing, you would be mistaken, at least in 1867. In fact, it became known as Seward's Folly. People are said, dude, yeah, sure, it's pretty. There's mountains, there's trees, there's snow. It's dark for half the year. Why in the world would you pay over $7 million for a frozen icebox? And it became known as Seward's Folly. But two things here. Number one is it became an important first step because it's the first time we're reaching beyond the Pacific Ocean border of California, Oregon, Washington State. We pushed beyond the borders of our traditional mainland United States and acquired a territory that's not directly connected. First important step. Number two important legacy was that, in 1896, he looked like a genius because gold was discovered and there was a big Alaskan gold rush. And of course, later on, oil was discovered and even better. Great resources. Now, while Alaska was seen as a folly, or initially that is, the more important step than Alaska became one of my favorite places in the world, Hawaii. Now, I love Hawaii for a number of reasons. Number one is I got married there. Love Hawaii. But Hawaii, since 1795, had been its own unified kingdom. Now, despite that, there had been a sizable American missionary settlement that had been there as well, along with a number of U.S. planters. And since 1875, Hawaii was able to enter into a trade agreement with the United States to allow the export of Hawaiian sugar into the United States without paying, tariffs or taxes. In exchange for this, in exchange for Hawaii saying, sure, we'll give you all of our sugar, happy to do so. In exchange, Hawaii received the promise that none of its territory would ever be taken over by the United States. Well, shortly thereafter, in the 1880s, sugar production boomed. Great sugar production place, sugarcane. And soon American settlers became very, very wealthy and formed their own economic elite in Hawaii. Of course, they built their fortunes by using cheap laborers from China, Japan, and Portugal. Again, mostly from China and Japan. Again, working the sugarcane fields. And by the time of the 1890s, the native Hawaiian population had been reduced to a minority, thanks to diseases brought in by foreigners, especially smallpox. Again, sound familiar? Excuse me. Asians became the largest group in Hawaii, mostly Chinese and some Japanese. But the elite, rich whites really are the ones who ran the island. If the story sounds familiar, it should sound just like Texas. In 1887, the American white elites forced the king of Hawaii to accept a new constitution for his nation, which would grant the elites the ability to dominate government and basically have free special privilege. But then, in 1890, the McKinley Tariff threatened to destroy the sugar industry. Because now, the McKinley Tariff would put a tariff on Hawaiian sugar. and it sends the islands into political and economic crisis. So things are getting bad for that white, rich, elite planter group. Because Hawaii is a foreign nation, they are subject to that McKinley Tariff in 1890. Then things get worse. And they thought they had good here because they forced the king to take on a new constitution that gave them favor. But the McKinley Tariff puts their livelihoods in jeopardy. And then in 1891, the king's sister, Queen Liliuokalani, became the new queen. She ascended to the throne. And she had the audacity to try to eliminate the white control of her government. Now, I'm sure you can all imagine the whites took this very well. And they said, "Oh, you're the queen. Thank you very much. We honor you. We will leave." Just kidding. They revolt. They stage an armed rebellion against Queen Liliuokalani. And in 1893, these whites will seize power and oust and force the queen to abdicate her throne. And she will be the last native Hawaiian to rule her country. Oh, fun fact. That revolt that the elite whites, led to overthrow the queen and put themselves in power was led by a man by the name of Sanford Dole. You may have heard of him. Yep, Dole Plantation, Dole Pineapples. And so in 1893, these white elites will successfully overthrow Queen Liliuokalani. The native Hawaiians have lost their kingdom. And in 1894, white elites proclaim the islands of Hawaii an independent republic. They will elect Sanford Dole as their first leader. And when William McKinley takes office, he promises to annex Hawaii, which means no more problem with tariff because now they are part of the nation. All part of America's manifest destiny. And again, a new stepping stone to get to China. So we're getting closer now. Now we're in the right direction. We are moving westward through the Pacific to get to China. But this entire venture now is being spearheaded. This entire vision of getting to China is being spearheaded by this man right here, John Hay. Now, John Hay was once the private secretary to Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War. But by the 1890s, he is now Secretary of State. And he will leave two very important legacies. Number one is he is the one who will lay the foundation for the construction of the Panama Canal. His second important legacy is the adoption of what became known as the open door policy. Now, the open door policy is kind of remarkable that it actually works. So what happens is he writes this thing called the open door notes that becomes known as the open door policy. And basically it's a general foreign policy concept that prevents one nation from establishing preferential duties in a colonial possession. What does this mean? Well, let me show you here. Here's China. Here's what China looks like in the 1890s. China has lost its own sovereignty. It is technically a separate nation still, but they're not technically controlled by any one nation. Instead, they are governed by what's called spheres of influence. You look at that list: Russia, Japan, Britain, France, Germany. Who's not there? The United States. So remember, we're late to the party. We're late to this imperial party, this empire party. So John Hay writes these open door notes and sends this letter to every major nation in the world, every major imperial power, and basically argues that, yeah, it's not fair that you guys should control and dominate any one nation yourself. What should happen, and this is officially adopted in 1899, what should happen was that everyone should have access to trade with the nation. And let the people living there decide what goods they want and where they want them from. What John Hay was arguing was, if only China could get American goods. American goods are the best in the world. They will choose the American goods over the British goods or the Russian goods or the Japanese goods. And for him, while this technically this open door policy was sent to every nation, about every nation, it was mainly directed at China. So that the United States would have an open door access to get to the large 400 million person marketplace where they could trade, where they could exploit the cheap laborers of China and establish military bases overseas. And so he thought this would be the way to open up China to American goods. And honestly, he'll be right. But to get there, it'll take a war. And so, historically now, we're going to have a war, the Spanish-American War, or if you're abbreviating your notes, just call it the Spam War. It's great, Span, Am, so Spanish-American. It's an easy way to write it. So the Spam War. And of course, the hero of the Spam War is none other than future president himself and future wax figure in a movie, Night at the Museum, Teddy Roosevelt. Now, the issue of the Spanish-American War starts out as Cuba. And of course, Cuba was controlled by Spain. Now, Spain, historically speaking, was one of the first countries to explore and colonize the New World. And had been an empire that was raging strong for hundreds of years. Since 1492 when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, right? So here's a picture of their empire at the height of their power. This small little peninsular nation of Europe controls a vast empire. But by 1898, the end of the 19th century, they'd kind of fallen into hard times. Yeah. That's the Spanish Empire, the once mighty Spanish. It is so bad that we even had to circle some islands out here because they're too small to see. But very importantly, still this area right over here known as Cuba. Now, Cuba is where we're going to start our story at here. Cuba, for the last 25 years of the 19th century, they've been fighting multiple wars of independence against Spain. Cubans wanted to be free of the tyrannical rule of Spain, very similar to how we wanted to be free of British rule back in 1776. And by the 1890s, the fighting was reaching a crescendo. The Cubans relied on guerrilla-style warfare and sabotage. They would cut railroad lines, destroy sugar mills, and set fire to cane fields. The response of the Spanish was to herd 500,000 Cubans from their home. Not all fighters, but just people. 500,000 Cubans from their homes and put them into fortified camps, wherein 200,000 of them would die of disease and starvation. It was devastating to the Cubans. But why does Americans care? Well, for a few reasons. Number one is this kind of imagery did stir up some sympathy to the Cubans. We were outraged, morally outraged, that the Spanish would do this to Cubans. And yes, we did feel that they're fighting a war of independence very similar to our own war of independence. But more importantly speaking, they are geographically close to us. And when it comes to sugar, quite honestly, we actually traded more with Cuba than Spain did. And their cigars were second to none. Now, President McKinley in 1898 was not itching to start a war, but to protect American business interests, he would decide to send in a ship to Havana Harbor to protect our interests and keep the port at Havana open. You see, a riot had broken out in Havana Harbor, and so to protect our business interests, again, this is the U.S. government protecting big business, they will send the USS Maine into Havana Harbor. But it is two unrelated events that will eventually propel us into a war against Spain. The first event was known as the Dole letter. Now, pay attention to our dates here for a minute, okay? In early 1898, President McKinley sent or commissioned the USS Maine to go to Havana Harbor. It's not got there yet in February, but it will shortly. On February 9th, 1898, the New York Journal newspaper is going to publish a letter that was intercepted from Dupuy de Lome. Now, Dupuy de Lome was a Spanish minister to Washington, and this letter was entitled, the title of the article in the newspaper was, quote, "The worst insult to the United States in history." Yes, so the New York Journal posted this intercepted letter from the Spanish minister to Washington, Dupuy de Lome, and they titled the article, "The Worst Insult to the United States in its History." Again, a little hyperbole here, but you know. In this letter, and I'm sure you can't read the Spanish in this cursive Spanish, poor handwriting, Dupuy de Lome describes President McKinley as a, quote, "cheap politician," unquote, and a, quote, "bitter for the admiration of the crowd," unquote. In other words, he insults the president. Now, I'm sure the average American did more than that on a daily basis, but to have it come from a foreign dignitary was seen as a big slap in the face. And the fact that the New York Journal published it with these very sensationalistic headlines only stirred up this animosity against the Spanish that had already been building thanks to the, riots, the death camps. Again, this is using sensationalism to try to promote this message. Then, just 6 days later, on February 15th, 1898, just 6 days after the Dole letter is published in the New York Journal, the USS Maine explodes in Havana Harbor. So it had gotten there, and suddenly it explodes. Here's an actual image from it, salvaging the wreckage. So 6 days after the Dole letter is published in the New York Journal, the USS Maine explodes in Havana Harbor. 260 U.S. sailors are dead. And what did the paper say? Spanish ships on our coast. Now, hey, one more picture. Here we go. Destruction of the warship Maine was the work of the enemy. Assistant Secretary Roosevelt convinced explosion was not an accident. Crisis at hand, Spanish treachery, extra, extra, read all about it. This type of journalism became known as yellow journalism. In other words, yellow journalism was especially utilized by two very prominent journalists. One was William Randolph Hearst, and he's the one who actually wrote for the New York Journal. And the second one was a man by the name of Joseph Pulitzer. You might recognize his name. He is known now as the Pulitzer Prize for Award for Best Journalist. But what these guys were known for was what's called yellow journalism. Yellow journalism is using sensationalistic headlines to attract readers. In other words, we're going to use the most sensational sensationalistic headlines possible in order to attract you to pick up their newspaper, buy it, and read it. You want to put it in modern day 2020 verbiage, it's called clickbait. The top 10 reasons that Beyonce did this, number 7 will surprise you. Clickbait. And so this clickbait yellow journalism pioneered and perfected by William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, not only did it keep Americans informed about what was going on in the Spanish-American War, it also pushed us into the war because Americans began to get patriotically, fervently behind William McKinley, believing that, yes, indeed, this right here was the work of the Spanish. Fun fact, guys, years later, it will be discovered that the explosion of the USS Maine was caused by an overheated boiler on the ship itself. Yeah, the Spanish had nothing to do with it, but the newspaper said it was true, therefore it must be true, and we are now going to war. Headlines proclaimed, "Remember the Maine." The spirit of war pervades the breast of all Americans. By early March, U.S. Congress authorized $50 million to go to war, and we are now going to be at war. By the way, our old friend John Hay, he will coin this war a splendid little war because it starts in April and it ends in August. Essentially, it's your summer vacation. We had a whole war fought over your summer break. More than 1 million volunteers of Americans will volunteer to fight, and fewer than 500 will actually be killed or wounded in combat. In fact, more men will die of sickness and eating bad food than will actually die in battle. So hence the term splendid little war. Now you guys know me by now. I don't focus much on wars. The most important battle, though, was the Battle of San Juan Hill, in which it allowed Teddy Roosevelt to lead his Rough Rider Brigade straight up that hill and took the hill from the Spanish in San Juan, Puerto Rico. And the result of this, of course, was that Teddy Roosevelt was able to build his reputation and eventually become president as a result of it. Because he led his brave, fearless troops straight into the teeth of the Spanish defenses and took it from the Spanish. Now, this is the story that made him famous. Unfortunately, this is a very idealized kind of myth of what the Spanish-American War was, the Battle of San Juan Hill. In fact, in the immediate aftermath of the Battle of San Juan Hill, Teddy Roosevelt credited his victory not just to his Rough Rider troops that were with him, but he specifically named 2 all-black infantry regiments, the 9th and 10th Infantry. So in his immediate aftermath of this battle, Teddy Roosevelt said, yeah, we did great, but we couldn't have done it if not for the 9th and 10th regiments, infantry regiments, who were all black regiments. They played an equally vital role in winning the battle. Now, unfortunately, for everyone concerned, Teddy Roosevelt began to leave that detail out as his popularity increased in the United States and he had political aspirations. And again, quote from Teddy Roosevelt himself, he proclaimed that the black troops were, quote, an excellent breed of Yankee, unquote. So he proclaimed them to be every bit as brave as the white man was. They were an excellent breed of American on par with the white. But yet, over time, he began to downplay the importance of black troops in the Spanish-American War. And therefore, though that continued racist beliefs that blacks were not as skilled, as brave, as dependable troops would prevail all the way through into World War II. Setting back African-American civil rights. But nonetheless, I'll digress from that for a minute. In 1899, again, the war ends in August of 1898, but the treaty is not signed until 1899. The Treaty of Paris, yes, another Treaty of Paris. Treaty of Paris, 1899. That will officially end the Spanish-American War. The U.S. will get some of Spain's colonies, including Cuba. Guam, Puerto Rico, and the creme de la creme, the prized possession, the Philippines. Yes, the Philippines. You see, now, in exchange, we will actually give Spain $20 million. Why? Because that does happen often in a war. We give some small compensation, but we're getting the big thing here. We are, first of all, not technically going to get control of Cuba. Cuba became a protectorate that we said, well, we will oversee you until you get back on your feet. And then once you're back on your feet, we will step back and you can be independent once again. Now, did we really mean that? Well, for the most part, we tried, but we actually would not give their independence to them until 1920s. So it wasn't quite as soon as they wanted, but eventually we did give them independence. However, what we really got here was Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. Now, Puerto Rico becomes a kind of a troublesome spot because we never grant them statehood. We don't allow them voting rights, but yet we allow them as citizens to travel. Like, it's a very weird, it's called an unincorporated territory. So we don't really want them, but yet we want a colony. So we could deal a whole semester on Puerto Rico. But the other two, that's in the Caribbean. The bigger two back in 1898 we focused on was Guam and specifically the Philippines. Because these were the stepping stones we needed to get to China. Because the Philippines is, again, right below China, just south of China. Now, as you can see, we're stepping over the Philippines. Remember, our goal here is not just, the Philippines is great, fine, it's an island, whatever. We want to use them to get our way to get to China. Now, remember, our initial aim of the Spanish-American War was to get rid of Spain for Cuba, help Cuba get their independence, right? But after the war's over, President McKinley casts his lot with all those imperialists. Like, we're going to give Cuba their independence. That's all well and good. Everyone agrees with that. But these imperialists pushed for the acquisition of Guam and the Philippines. And in the process, McKinley also annexes Hawaii. And so the reality is, in 1898, we become a full-fledged imperial empire. We annex Hawaii. We get temporary control of Cuba. We get Puerto Rico. But we also get Guam, which is still to this day a military base. And we get control of the Philippines, who are going to welcome us because we're going to bring our white man's burden to them. We are going to civilize them, and we're going to educate them in proper civilization, democracy, and of course, capitalism. As you can see by this cartoon, we are going to educate them. Uncle Sam is going to, America is going to. If you can read these right here, we have, of course, Philippines, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Cuba. Again, while the proper white students are doing their proper work, Uncle Sam's having to, use a little corporal punishment and persuade them through a little force. Because after all, they should be welcoming us, right? We're going to set them free from their backward ways. The thing is, the Philippines were not happy we were there. In fact, like Cuba, the Filipinos have been fighting an insurgent warfare for years, trying to get rid of the tyrannical Spanish. They wanted their independence too. And therefore, as soon as they were bought by the United States for $20 million, they were not happy. No one asked the people who lived there, such as the Filipinos, if they wanted the Americans there. And soon after the acquisition of the Philippines, the Filipino people, led by many people, but one of the more famous ones is Emilio Aguinaldo. he begins to basically says, oh, we were fighting the Spanish. Now we're fighting the Americans. We still want our independence. We don't want the American. We don't want anyone to. We want our own independence, not to be controlled by a foreign power. This is an important turning point for the United States. This is our first colonial acquisition this war led to. It's also the first time our troops are going to fight overseas. Now, it'll happen much more after this, to the present day. But the Filipino-American War, the Philippine-American War, becomes the first time we send U.S. troops to fight on foreign soil. These Filipino rebels have been fighting against the Spanish. It was easy to transfer that spirit of independence to fight against the Americans. Over 4 years of fighting will ensue. So the splendid little war that got the Philippines for us led to a 4-year struggle, a 4-year war. As the Filipino rebels fought against the United States. During this 4 years, over 120,000 U.S. soldiers will serve in the Philippines. More than 4,300 will die. Remember that? We lost 500 or fewer. 500 dead and wounded in the Spanish-American War. But over the next 4 years, we will lose 4,300 troops in the Philippine-American War. At a cost of $160 million. 8 times what we actually paid. Remember we paid $20 million for basically the Philippines from Spain? The subsequent war will cost $160 million. And the unpleasant truth to this war is that America's actions in the Philippines were virtually indistinguishable from Spain's actions in Cuba. Remember they threw the Cubans in concentration camps and saw 200,000 dead? We use very similar tactics. Because the reality is the United States refused to acknowledge the Filipino aspiration for self-government that the Cubans had also longed for. We supported the Cubans, but not the Filipinos. And we ultimately would use very similar tactics that the Spanish used, including concentration camps, including things like the water cure. Now, most students say this like, oh, it's waterboarding. No, waterboarding is torture. This is also torture, yes. But waterboarding is a method where you pour water over the face to make the person feel like they're drowning. This is, they hold the person down, and they force the Filipino rebel to drink large quantities of water in a short amount of time. Now, this is physically pouring water down their throats. And when you pour a large amount of water, not only do you burn your esophagus, like if you drink too much water at one time, it's going to burn your esophagus. But if you drink a large quantity of that, it's going to go in your stomach, it's going to cause your stomach to swell. If you drink too much of it, it'll cause your stomach to burst and kill you. And that's assuming the water is clean drinking water. This is most often the case. It was not clean drinking water. It was often salt water from the ocean, which is detrimental if you drink in large quantities and kills you, ruins your organs. That's assuming it was just clean salt water. Often the soldiers, American soldiers, would pee in it first or defecate in it first. So they are drinking urinated fecal salt water, being forcibly poured down their throats in a torture manner because they viewed Filipinos as subhuman, as lower racially than whites. It leads to water poisoning, stomach swelling, intense pain, and of course, death. Americans lost 4,300 men. More than 15,000 Filipinos die from fighting, directly from fighting. Somewhere between 50 and 200,000 more Filipinos will die of disease and starvation during the Filipino-American War. And of course, this is all justified in the Americans' minds because they viewed Filipinos as akin to Indians or blacks, underscoring the idea that colonialism was based on social Darwinism. They were just not physically fit to survive, and therefore whites had the duty to take them over. Now, in 1902, by the way, these images are terrible. I hate this slide. But the fact is, most Americans never saw this slide, this picture. Americans didn't find out about this until the 1940s because the American government hid it from the American people. They didn't want to admit it. These are war crimes. But yet, this is what the American troops did. In 1902, President Teddy Roosevelt declared the Philippines had been pacified. The Americans had won the war was over. He also said that all the major leaders had been killed, which is why the war is over. Fun fact, Liliuokalani actually lived until 1964. But yet, Roosevelt declared him dead in 1902. This war really began to question our necessity to be an imperial nation. On the one hand, promises made, promises kept. McKinley and Roosevelt. The American flag has not been planted on foreign soil to acquire more territory, but for humanity's sake. We are coming to free the world. That's not freedom. That's torture. Cartoons, we're shielding the Cubans from foreigners to protect them. But there's another side to it too. Yeah, we are stamping all over the Philippines. Why? Right there. Because the reality is creating a base, military base, yes, but a port in the Philippines was significant. It became our jumping off point, our launching point into China. Thanks to our acquisition of the Philippines, we are now able to enact the open door policy. And thus, we are able to enact what we really wanted, the economic spread of our capitalism to those 400 million people in China. So, how do we conclude this? Well, the hostile takeover of the Philippines and Hawaii marked a turning point in U.S. history. A turning point in U.S. foreign policy. It was a watershed moment when officially America became a colonial power. Now the U.S. had assets, colonial assets, in multiple places, and would increasingly be using those global assets to influence global affairs. By the way, the United States will hold on to the Philippines against their will until 1946. That's a good place to stop. When we come back next time, we'll talk about a little more positive things. How do we clean up the crap of the Gilded Age? But until then, take care and bye-bye.